Welcome to the From 9/11 to Withdrawal, the Two-Decade-Long Afghanistan War, a podcast that delves into one of the longest wars in modern history, the Afghanistan War. For over 2 decades, the conflict in Afghanistan has shaped international politics and impacted the lives of millions of people around the world. From the initial invasion by the United States and its allies in 2001 to the recent withdrawal of troops in 2021, this war has been marked by complex geopolitical dynamics, shifting military strategies, and tragic human costs. In this podcast, we will explore the various dimensions of the Afghanistan War, including its origins, the major actors involved, the impact on Afghan society, the role of the media, and the lessons learned. Through interviews with experts, journalists, soldiers, and civilians, we will examine the war from multiple perspectives and seek to understand its complexities and nuances. Join us as we embark on a journey to uncover the untold stories of the Afghanistan War and gain a deeper understanding of this pivotal moment in history. The causes and background of the Afghanistan War. The Afghanistan War, also known as the War in Afghanistan, is one of the longest and most complex conflicts in modern history. The war began in 2001 with the invasion of Afghanistan by the United States and its allies, in response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks on American soil. The initial objective of the invasion was to eliminate the al-Qaeda terrorist network and remove the Taliban regime, which was harboring them, from power. The Taliban, a hardline Islamist group that had seized control of Afghanistan in the mid-1990s, provided a safe haven for al-Qaeda and its leader, Osama bin Laden. The U.S. government held the Taliban responsible for the 9/11 attacks and demanded that they hand over bin Laden and his associates. When the Taliban refused to comply, the U.S. launched a military campaign in Afghanistan, which quickly overthrew the Taliban regime and disrupted al-Qaeda's operations. However, the war did not end with the fall of the Taliban. Instead, it evolved into a broader conflict, with multiple actors and competing interests. The U.S. and its allies remained in Afghanistan to support the newly established Afghan government and to combat a resurgent Taliban insurgency, which sought to regain power. The war became increasingly complex, with the involvement of other countries, such as Pakistan and Iran, and the rise of other militant groups, such as the Islamic State, IS, and the Haqqani network. The conflict in Afghanistan has taken a heavy toll on the Afghan people, with over 100,000 civilian deaths and millions displaced. The war has also had a significant impact on the U.S. and its allies, with over 3,500 coalition military deaths and a cost of trillions of dollars. Despite efforts to find a political solution, the war in Afghanistan continued for over 2 decades, until a peace agreement was reached between the U.S. and the Taliban in 2020. In 2021, the U.S. withdrew its troops from Afghanistan, ending its longest war in history. However, the future of Afghanistan remains uncertain, with ongoing violence, political instability, and humanitarian concerns. In this podcast, we will explore the causes and background of the Afghanistan War, as well as its impact on Afghanistan, the U.S., and the international community. We will examine the complex geopolitical dynamics and competing interests that have shaped the conflict, and seek to understand the lessons learned from this pivotal moment in history. Join us as we delve into the Afghanistan Chronicles. U.S. intervention in Afghanistan, Operation Infinite Justice and Operation Enduring Freedom. The United States intervention in Afghanistan, known as Operation Infinite Justice and later renamed Operation Enduring Freedom, was a military campaign that began in October 2001 in response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks on American soil. The operation aimed to remove the Taliban regime from power and eliminate al-Qaeda's presence in Afghanistan. Operation Infinite Justice, the original name for the military campaign, was intended to convey the United States' determination to bring those responsible for the 9/11 attacks to justice. However, the name was later changed to Operation Enduring Freedom to avoid offending Muslim sensibilities. The U.S. and its allies launched a massive military campaign that involved airstrikes, ground operations, and support for local Afghan forces. The campaign quickly ousted the Taliban regime from power and disrupted al-Qaeda's operations in Afghanistan. However, the military campaign was not without controversy. The use of airstrikes and ground operations resulted in numerous civilian casualties, sparking outrage and criticism from both the Afghan people and the international community. The U.S. military also faced allegations of abuse and mistreatment of detainees at detention centers such as Guantanamo Bay. Despite the initial success of the military campaign, the conflict in Afghanistan continued for over 2 decades, with the U.S. and its allies remaining in the country to support the Afghan government and combat a resurgent Taliban insurgency. The war became increasingly complex, with the involvement of other countries, such as Pakistan and Iran, and the rise of other militant groups, such as the Islamic State, IS, and the Haqqani network. The U.S. military suffered over 3,500 deaths and a cost of trillions of dollars during the conflict. The war also had a significant impact on the Afghan people, with over 100,000 civilian deaths and millions displaced. In 2020, the U.S. and the Taliban signed a peace agreement, with the U.S. agreeing to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan. In 2021, the U.S. completed its withdrawal, ending its longest war in history. However, the future of Afghanistan remains uncertain, with ongoing violence, political instability, and humanitarian concerns. The fall of the Taliban and the Hamid Karzai government. The fall of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan in 2001 marked a turning point in the country's history and the ongoing conflict that would last for over 2 decades. The collapse of the Taliban government paved the way for the establishment of a new democratic government led by President Hamid Karzai. The fall of the Taliban regime was the result of a U.S.-led military campaign that began in October 2001. The Taliban regime, which had seized control of Afghanistan in the mid-1990s, had provided a safe haven for al-Qaeda and its leader, Osama bin Laden. The U.S. government held the Taliban responsible for the 9/11 attacks and demanded that they hand over bin Laden and his associates. When the Taliban refused to comply, the U.S. launched a military campaign in Afghanistan. The U.S. military campaign was joined by Afghan opposition forces known as the Northern Alliance, who had been fighting the Taliban regime for years. Together, they overthrew the Taliban regime within weeks and established a new government. Hamid Karzai, a former Afghan government official who had fled the country during the Taliban's rise to power, was chosen to lead the new government. Karzai, who had extensive experience in diplomacy and international relations, was seen as a unifying figure who could bring together Afghanistan's various ethnic and political factions. Under Karzai's leadership, the new Afghan government began the process of rebuilding the country and establishing a democratic system of government. The government faced numerous challenges, including security threats from the Taliban insurgency, corruption, and the difficulties of governing a country that had been devastated by years of war. Despite these challenges, the Karzai government made progress in areas such as education, healthcare, and infrastructure development. The government also took steps to address human rights issues, including the rights of women and minorities. However, the Karzai government faced criticism from some quarters, particularly for its failure to address corruption and its inability to provide security to the Afghan people. The government also faced challenges from the Taliban insurgency, which grew in strength and launched numerous attacks on government targets. In 2014, Karzai stepped down as president, and Ashraf Ghani was elected as his successor. The transition of power was seen as a milestone for Afghanistan's democratic process, but the country continued to face ongoing security challenges and political instability. Conclusion: the political, humanitarian, and military outcomes of the Afghanistan War. The Afghanistan War, which lasted for over 2 decades, had significant political, humanitarian, and military consequences both within Afghanistan and around the world. From a political perspective, the Afghanistan War marked a significant shift in global politics, particularly in terms of the fight against terrorism. The U.S. government's decision to launch a military campaign in Afghanistan in response to the 9/11 attacks marked the beginning of a new era in U.S. foreign policy, one that emphasized preemptive military action against potential threats to national security. The war also had significant humanitarian consequences, particularly for the Afghan people. The war caused widespread displacement and suffering, with millions of Afghans forced to flee their homes and seek refuge elsewhere. The conflict also had a devastating impact on Afghanistan's infrastructure, healthcare, and education systems, further exacerbating the country's already dire humanitarian situation. On the military front, the Afghanistan War was a long and costly conflict that claimed the lives of tens of thousands of people, including U.S. soldiers, Afghan military personnel, and civilians. The conflict also resulted in significant financial costs, with the U.S. government spending over $2 trillion on the war effort. Despite these costs and the sacrifices made by those involved, the war ultimately failed to achieve its primary objectives. While the Taliban regime was overthrown, the subsequent years saw the rise of an insurgency that continued to pose a significant threat to Afghanistan's stability and security. Moreover, the war had unintended consequences, including the spread of extremist ideologies and the destabilization of neighboring countries. The Afghanistan War also had broader geopolitical consequences, particularly in terms of the US's relationships with its allies and adversaries. The war strained relations with Pakistan, which has been accused of supporting the Taliban insurgency. It also raised questions about the US's commitment to global leadership and its ability to achieve its foreign policy objectives through military force. In conclusion, the Afghanistan War had far-reaching political, humanitarian, and military consequences, with implications that are likely to be felt for years to come. The war highlighted the complex nature of modern warfare and the challenges of achieving lasting peace and stability in conflict-ridden countries. It also raised important questions about the role of military force in achieving political objectives and the importance of considering the long-term consequences of military interventions. As we conclude this podcast series on the Afghanistan War, it is clear that this conflict was a complex and multifaceted event with significant political, humanitarian, and military consequences. It was a conflict that lasted for over 2 decades, claiming the lives of tens of thousands of people and costing trillions of dollars. The war was initiated in response to the 9/11 attacks, with the aim of overthrowing the Taliban regime and eliminating the threat posed by al-Qaeda. While the initial military campaign was successful in achieving these objectives, the subsequent years saw the rise of an insurgency that continued to pose a significant threat to Afghanistan's stability and security. Despite the efforts of the U.S. military and its allies, the war ultimately failed to achieve its primary objectives. While the Taliban regime was overthrown, the subsequent years saw the rise of an insurgency that continued to pose a significant threat to Afghanistan's stability and security. The war had unintended consequences, including the spread of extremist ideologies and the destabilization of neighboring countries. As we reflect on the Afghanistan war, it is important to remember the sacrifices made by those who served in the conflict, including the brave men and women of the U.S. military and their allies, as well as the Afghan people who endured years of conflict and hardship. It is also important to learn from the mistakes and shortcomings of the conflict and to work towards building a more peaceful and stable world, one that prioritizes diplomacy, cooperation, and mutual understanding. We hope that this podcast has provided a comprehensive and informative look at the Afghanistan war and its impact on the world, and that it has inspired listeners to reflect on the importance of peace and stability in our global community.